August 1969. This is the 69th episode. Sometimes these things just write themselves. Hundreds of thousands of young people are making their way along the roads of New York, heading for Yasgur's farm to camp out on the land, leave everything behind for 3 days, and of course, join in one big rock and roll band. We all know what happened there. Jimi Hendrix and the Star-Spangled Banner, Santana's explosive soul sacrifice, Joe Cocker, and with a little help from my friends, Sly and the Family Stone took us higher. The Who brought us Tommy. These are the images and the music that turned Woodstock into a legend. But where are Creedence Clearwater Revival, Janis Joplin, Grateful Dead and the band? Where is Johnny Winter? And who the hell are Bert Sommer, Quill, and the Keith Hartley band? They were all there, on the same stage, in front of the same audience, at the same Woodstock. But if you only know the festival from the famous film and the 2 original soundtrack albums, then you've never seen them, and you've never heard them. So how much of Woodstock do we actually know? Woodstock was enormous, not just in size, but especially in what the festival would ultimately come to mean. From August 15th to 18th, 1969, 32 acts took the stage on Max Yasgur's farm. Nearly 500,000 people came to Bethel, New York. But even those who were there couldn't possibly take in everything. The site was enormous, the performances continued day and night, and the sound system was actually designed for a much smaller audience. So for the rest of the world, Woodstock was largely shaped by what came after the festival: the famous film and the 2 original soundtrack albums. Richie Havens, Country Joe, Jefferson Airplane, one by one, they became part of Woodstock's collective memory. But to tell the story of a festival with 32 acts, a selection had to be made. And every selection means something gets left behind. Sometimes a song, sometimes a performance, and sometimes an entire artist. And that's exactly the Woodstock we're going looking for. The artist you could hear but couldn't see. The artist who disappeared from both the film and the soundtracks. And even some major names that make you wonder, how could they possibly be missing? Because behind the Woodstock, everyone knows. There's another Woodstock that almost nobody knows. Of course, there are artists we do know from the film and the soundtracks, but even there, things aren't always quite what they seem. Take Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. Their Woodstock appearance was only their second show together as a 4-piece. But if you only know the famous film, you could almost be forgiven for thinking Neil Young was somewhere else that night. He was definitely there. Young simply didn't want to be filmed during the electric portion of the set. He felt that the cameras on stage were getting between the musicians and the audience. And the soundtrack has a curious footnote of its own. Sea of Madness appears on it as part of Woodstock, but the recording you're hearing isn't from Woodstock at all. It was recorded about a month later at the Fillmore East. The actual Woodstock version wouldn't be officially released until much later. So even when an artist makes both the film and the soundtrack, that doesn't necessarily mean we're getting the whole story. Which brings us to 3 artists who weren't quite so lucky. They didn't make the film, but fortunately, they did make the records. We begin on Friday night with Melanie. Melanie was only 22 when she stepped onto the stage. In fact, that wasn't when she was supposed to perform at all. The rain had thrown the schedule into chaos, and when the incredible string band refused to perform during the downpour, Melanie was moved forward. There was just one problem. She had never played in front of such an enormous crowd before. As the rain continued to fall, people in the audience lit candles and cigarette lighters. The sight made such an impression on her that it later inspired Lay Down. Her performance didn't make the film, but 2 songs, Beautiful People and Birthday of the Sun, later appeared on the album Woodstock 2. Later on Sunday, the rain would once again bring the festival to a standstill. This time, the crowd spontaneously broke into a no-rain chant. Apparently, it didn't work. Mountain had a very different problem. They were barely even a band. Woodstock was one of their very first performances, and suddenly, Leslie West and company were standing in front of hundreds of thousands of people. Not a bad place to get some stage experience. Appropriately enough, their set included a then untitled song that would later become For Yasgur's Farm. Mountain also disappeared from the original film, but Blood of the Sun and theme for an imaginary Western still found their way onto Woodstock too. And then there's the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. By that point, Butterfield was certainly no stranger to major festivals. His band had already played Monterey Pop 2 years earlier. At Woodstock, they didn't get their turn until around 6 o'clock on Monday morning, by which time a large part of the original crowd had long since headed home. Their 7-song set ended with Love March and Everything's Gonna Be All Right. Film footage? No, but Love March appeared on the original Woodstock soundtrack, while Everything's Gonna Be All Right later appeared on Woodstock 2. So if you only knew Woodstock from the movie theater, Melanie, Mountain, and Butterfield practically didn't exist. Bought the records? Then at least you got a glimpse of their Woodstock. And compared with what comes next, they actually got off pretty well. Because from here on, we're moving on to artists who made neither the film nor either of the 2 original soundtrack albums. No Melanie, no Mountain, no Butterfield. Completely gone. Although,
Me and my pals are going to Woodstock to smoke dope.
No, you are not, Chris Griffin. You are grounded.
Oh, I hate you! Now I'll never get to see Sha-Na-Na!
from here, the story gets a whole lot stranger. Because the next 7 acts actually played Woodstock, but none of them made the original film. And the 2 classic soundtrack albums? Nothing there either. We begin on Friday night with Sweetwater. They were actually supposed to open Woodstock. But like so many plans that weekend, things turned out differently. The band got stuck in traffic, so Richie Havens was moved forward and ultimately became the man who opened Woodstock. Sweetwater eventually arrived and became the second act of the festival. Their music was an unusual blend of rock, folk, psychedelia, and classical influences, with cello, flute, and percussion alongside the more conventional rock instruments. Their set included Motherless Child, What's Wrong, Let the Sunshine In, and Oh Happy Day. 10 songs, no film, no soundtrack. And that pattern would repeat itself almost immediately that same evening. Bert Sommer was only 20 years old when he took the stage. He had already appeared in Hair and had released his first solo album earlier that year. But Woodstock was by far the biggest audience he had ever played for. And then something remarkable happened. During his performance of Simon and Garfunkel's America, the audience rose to its feet. A standing ovation. Sommer had just created one of the most memorable moments of the festival's first day. You'd think, perfect material for the film. Nope. Soundtrack? Nope. In fact, while Woodstock grew into one of the most famous events in popular music history, Bert Sommer was almost completely written out of the story. And perhaps that's the clearest example of just how much influence the film and soundtrack ultimately had. Just imagine if America had made the movie. Maybe we'd remember Bert Sommer very differently today. Sommer was followed by Tim Hardin, and he was hardly an unknown songwriter. Hardin wrote If I Were a Carpenter and Reason to Believe, songs that would go on to be recorded by countless other artists. But his own career was plagued by personal problems, and his Woodstock performance didn't exactly go smoothly either. He played songs including If I Were a Carpenter and Misty Roses. But once again, no film, no soundtrack. Then the atmosphere changed completely. Around midnight, Ravi Shankar took the stage. By then, Shankar had already had an enormous influence on Western popular culture. George Harrison had studied sitar with him. And 2 years earlier, Shankar had performed at Monterey Pop. At Woodstock, he played as the rain poured down. And there's a certain irony in that. Hippie culture had fully embraced Shankar's music and Indian spirituality, while Shankar himself had become increasingly uncomfortable with the drugs that had become part of that very same culture.
God damn it.
Whoa, how did I get here? Man, I'm so high!
Goddamn hippie!
Whoa, dude!
Get out of here!
Not cool! What's up?
He belonged to the era, but he didn't necessarily feel at home with everything that era represented. And his Woodstock set also disappeared from both the film and the original soundtracks. The following afternoon began with Quill, a psychedelic band from Boston who actually had one extra advantage. The filmmakers had asked them in advance to cooperate so the crew could practice filming a live band. In other words, footage existed. Apparently, it just wasn't good enough. Quill was cut from the finished film, and the soundtracks offered no rescue either. Next came the Keith Hartley Band. For this British blues rock group, Woodstock wasn't just a huge festival. It was their very first performance in America. Not exactly a cautious introduction to the American market. They played a hard-driving blues rock set featuring songs including Spanish Fly, Rock Me Baby, and Sinnin' for You. But anyone relying on the film and soundtrack back home would never have known they were there. And finally, the incredible string band. They had originally been scheduled to play on Friday night, directly after Ravi Shankar. But when the rain came down, they decided to postpone their performance. Even the massive no rain chant couldn't change that. Melanie took their place. A day later, they finally got their chance. But Saturday afternoon may not have been the ideal setting for their delicate psychedelic folk. Sandwiched between the much louder rock acts of the day, their performance struggled to make the same impact. And they too disappeared from the original Woodstock story. 7 acts, dozens of songs, thousands of people who actually saw them perform. And for everyone who later discovered Woodstock through the film and the records, they practically didn't exist. But maybe you're thinking by now, fair enough. Not every artist can make the finished film. Not every band can make the soundtrack. Choices have to be made, and maybe these simply weren't the most important names of the weekend. Fine. Then it's time to completely blow that argument to pieces. Because the next artist to disappear from both the film and the soundtracks, Grateful Dead, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Janis Joplin, the band Johnny Winter, Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Let's start with the Grateful Dead. If there's one band you automatically associate with the American hippie culture of the late 60s, it's them. San Francisco. Psychedelia, long jams, LSD, Woodstock should have been their natural habitat. In reality, it became one of the most problematic performances of their career. The rain had soaked the stage. There were problems with the electrical grounding. Band members were getting shocks from their instruments and microphones. Their heavy equipment caused problems with the revolving stage. And there were long pauses between songs. Not exactly ideal conditions for a band that normally thrived on spontaneity and improvisation. Still, the audience got St. Stephen, Dark Star, and eventually an almost endless version of Turn on Your Love Light. The band themselves were far from happy with the result. No soundtrack then. And the film? Not there either. One of the bands that, in hindsight, seems almost tailor-made for Woodstock was practically erased from the original Woodstock story. And their performance had another victim, because after Grateful Dead came Creedence Clearwater Revival. And in 1969, they weren't just another successful band. Creedence were one of the biggest bands in America. And there's another important detail about their presence at Woodstock. CCR were the first major act to actually sign on for the festival. Only after that did it become easier for the organizers to attract other big names. In other words, Creedence helped make Woodstock possible. But by the time they finally took the stage at around midnight, Grateful Dead had pushed the schedule back considerably. And according to John Fogerty, he was looking out at a mostly exhausted, sleeping audience. CCR still played 11 songs. Nothing but bangers, songs that have since become Creedence classics. But Fogerty was unhappy with the circumstances and didn't want the performance included in the film. The result? No film. No soundtrack. One of the biggest American bands of 1969 helped get Woodstock off the ground, and then disappeared from the Woodstock myth themselves. Shanana, still 2 for 2. And then it gets even stranger. Because a few hours after Creedence, Janis Joplin took the stage. 2 years earlier, her performance with Big Brother and the holding company at Monterey Pop had been one of the moments that turned her into a star almost overnight. Woodstock saw a different Janis. She had left Big Brother and was now performing with her new Cosmic Blues band, complete with a horn section. Her sound was moving further towards soul and R&B, and the setlist was hardly lacking. Even so, the performance wasn't regarded as one of her best. Critics felt the new band lacked the raw power of Big Brother, and Janis herself was said to be less than at her best that night. And so something happened that seems almost unimaginable in hindsight. Janis Joplin played Woodstock, and the original Woodstock film left her out completely. The 2 classic soundtrack albums didn't save her either. No Janis. But it doesn't stop there. Because on Sunday night, a group appeared whose name almost seems specially invented for this episode. The band. And their absence becomes even stranger when you consider where the whole Woodstock idea originally came from. The band had spent years playing with Bob Dylan. Dylan lived in Woodstock, New York. Music from Big Pink had emerged from precisely that musical world around Woodstock that had originally inspired the organizers. And now, the band were actually playing the festival that carried that name. They played 11 songs in total, but again, no film, no soundtrack. The band were at Woodstock, but not in the Woodstock that millions of people would later come to know. Next came Johnny Winter, a Texas blues guitarist whose reputation was rising fast at the time. Around midnight, Woodstock got more than an hour of electric blues, including Meantown Blues, Johnny B. Good, and 3 songs on which Johnny was joined by his brother Edgar Winter. Today, the performance is regarded as a powerful document of Winter at the height of his guitar playing. But in 1970, no film, no soundtrack. Which brings us to perhaps the strangest commercial case of them all: Blood, Sweat, and Tears. This was no obscure festival band. Their second album had been a massive success and included hits like Spinning Wheel and You've Made Me So Very Happy. They were part of their Woodstock set list. So they had the hits, they had the audience. They had a set full of material that would have fit perfectly on a soundtrack. But Blood, Sweat, and Tears were unhappy with the sound quality of their performance and didn't want to take part in the documentary or the soundtrack album. And that brings us full circle. Grateful Dead, Creedence, Janis Joplin, the band Johnny Winter, Blood, Sweat, and Tears. 6 major names. 6 artists who actually stood on that stage. And 0 representation in the original film and the 2 classic soundtrack albums. So maybe it's time to change the question. Not, how could they possibly be missing? But, how did we ever come to believe we knew Woodstock without them? By now, we found quite a few artists who actually played Woodstock, but somehow disappeared from the familiar story. But there's also an opposite category. Artists who seem to fit Woodstock so perfectly that you almost automatically assume they must have been there. Let's start with a small one. The Beatles, Abbey Road, Woodstock. It sounds almost inevitable, but the Beatles weren't there. In fact, by the summer of 1969, the group were busy working on Abbey Road, and the end was already drawing near. The band hadn't performed a conventional live concert together in years. Michael Lang realized the Beatles probably weren't a realistic option. So he then tried to bring John Lennon and the Plastic Ono Band to Woodstock instead. That never came together either. Okay. Then maybe they're great rivals? The Rolling Stones? Nope. The Stones were invited, but Mick Jagger was in Australia filming Ned Kelly, in which he actually played the title role as the famous Australian outlaw. Keith Richards, meanwhile, had just become a father. A few months later, The Stones would, of course, find themselves at the center of another free festival, Altamont. And let's just say that event earned a slightly different place in history. But that's a story for another time. No Beatles. No Stones. Then surely Bob Dylan. This is where things get really strange. Dylan actually lived in Woodstock. The festival itself didn't take place in the town of Woodstock, of course, but the whole musical idea behind the name was closely tied to Dylan and the artistic community that had grown around him there. Dylan himself may have been missing from Woodstock, but his songs weren't. Joan Baez performed I Shall Be Released. Melanie sang Mr. Tambourine Man. And Joe Cocker even played 3 Dylan songs: Dear Landlord, Just Like a Woman, and I Shall Be Released. So perhaps Dylan wasn't quite as absent from Woodstock as it seems. And yet Bob Dylan never took the stage. No serious negotiations ever developed. And Dylan instead chose another major festival, the Isle of Wight, where he would perform with the band 2 weeks later. So the band played I Shall Be Released at Woodstock without Dylan. And Dylan played the Isle of Wight with the band. Sometimes history has a strange sense of humor, but there is another absence that's almost the exact opposite. A group named Love. Think about it. Arthur Lee, Forever Changes, Psychedelia, Flower Power, Los Angeles in the late 60s. If you were asked to invent a band that somehow looked like it belonged at Woodstock, you could hardly do much better. Love feels like the ultimate Woodstock band. Except Love wasn't at Woodstock. And perhaps that's even more remarkable when you compare them with another band from exactly the same generation. The Velvet Underground. Because if Love seems almost perfectly suited to the romantic image of Woodstock, the Velvet Underground seems designed to destroy it. Just to be clear, there is no reliable evidence that Lou Reed and his band were ever actually invited to Woodstock. But their absence may tell us something even more interesting. Because Woodstock, New York, and New York City may have been in the same state. Culturally, they could feel like different planets. Out in the country, a generation was going back to the land. In Manhattan, Lou Reed was singing about heroin, sadomasochism, dealers, and the darker streets of New York. No flowers in your hair. Andy Warhol, The Factory, Feedback, Distortion. I'm waiting for the man. Love and the Velvet Underground belong to the same countercultural generation. But they represented almost opposite versions of it. And neither of them was at Woodstock. And if you think we're exaggerating that contrast with the benefit of hindsight, John Cale was pretty clear about hippie culture. We hated the Summer of Love with a vengeance. And Woodstock? We were happy they ended up in the mud. Serves them right. Okay, I guess that answers that question. Lou Reed's New York was simply a different world from Woodstock's New York. The Doors, then? Also, no, they were considered, but according to Robbie Krieger, they initially saw Woodstock as little more than a second-class repeat of Monterey Pop Festival. In hindsight, that may have been a slight miscalculation. Krieger later said they regretted it. And the best part? Krieger and drummer John Densmore did eventually go to Woodstock as audience members. Led Zeppelin? Invited. Didn't come. Manager Peter Grant felt that on such a huge bill, Zeppelin would simply become one band among many. Or, as he later put it, another band on the bill. In 1969, that may even have been a perfectly understandable business decision. With 57 years of hindsight, yeah. Then again, Sha Na Na was on the bill. And there were plenty of other major names missing. Donovan, for example. If Love sounds like a Woodstock band, Donovan practically looks like someone Woodstock would have invented. There was just one problem. He couldn't get into the country. Problems with his American visa following an earlier drug conviction kept one of the most recognizable figures of the Flower Power era away from the festival. Simon and Garfunkel weren't there either. There's no clear evidence that a serious Woodstock appearance was ever on the table, but while hundreds of thousands of people were heading towards Yasgur's farm, Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel were entering another defining chapter of their own career. Recording sessions for Bridge Over Troubled Water had begun that very week. Woodstock was becoming history. while Simon and Garfunkel were busy making some of their own. And then there are the Beach Boys. Now try to picture that for a moment. The Beach Boys. At Woodstock, it somehow feels completely natural and completely ridiculous at the same time. Only 2 years earlier, they had been announced for Monterey Pop before pulling out. By 1969, however, popular music had changed enormously. The striped shirts and California surf image belonged to an earlier version of the 60s, even though the actual Beach Boys themselves had already moved far beyond it. And perhaps they wouldn't even have been the strangest sight at Yasgur's farm. Imagine the monkeys turning up. Actually, forget that. Sha Na Na really was there. And what about the mamas and the papas? Few groups seem to embody the Californian side of the counterculture more completely. John Phillips had even helped create Monterey Pop. But by the time Woodstock happened, the group had effectively already fallen apart. The band that had helped define the Summer of Love didn't survive long enough to make it to Woodstock. So maybe our idea of what does and doesn't belong at Woodstock has always been a little too neat. The list goes on. The Byrds were tired of the festival circuit and initially saw little reason to believe Woodstock would be any different from all the other festivals that summer. Although former Byrd David Crosby was, of course, there with his new supergroup, Jethro Tull also declined. Ian Anderson had little affinity with hippie culture and didn't exactly see a weekend full of mud, drugs, and enormous crowds as his ideal working environment. The Moody Blues even appeared on an early Woodstock poster, but ultimately chose to play in Paris that same weekend. Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention were invited as well. Zappa's own summary years later was wonderfully concise. A lot of mud at Woodstock. We were invited to play there, we turned it down. And Iron Butterfly deserves a category of its own. They didn't say no. They were booked. But the band got stranded at LaGuardia Airport and apparently expected the organizers to simply send a helicopter to pick them up and fly them to the festival. Woodstock had slightly bigger problems at that point. The helicopter went to 10 years after instead. As we can hear Alvin Lee announce before his now iconic version of I'm Going Home by helicopter.
The thing called I'm Going Home by helicopter.
Iron Butterfly never made it to the stage. But there's one name we've deliberately saved until last: Joni Mitchell. Joni was supposed to perform at Woodstock, but her manager feared that the enormous traffic chaos around the festival would prevent her from making a scheduled television appearance on the Dick Cavett show. So she stayed in New York. Joni Mitchell never saw Woodstock. Not from the stage, not from the audience. She experienced it through television footage and through the stories of people who had actually been there. And then she wrote a song about it, Woodstock. By now, you may have started to feel that some of the titles in this episode sounded familiar. Everywhere, there was song. I Don't Know Who I Am. Caught in the Devil's Bargain. By the time we got to Woodstock. All words written by the woman, who was never actually at Woodstock herself. And maybe that's ultimately the perfect illustration of what Woodstock became. Because the meaning of Woodstock wasn't shaped only by the people who were there. It was also shaped by the stories, images, and music that came afterwards. Joni Mitchell didn't need to have been on Yasgur's farm to create one of the defining works of art about Woodstock. And her song also gives us exactly the words we need for the final step in our story. By now, we know who disappeared from the film, who never made the soundtracks, and even who never made it to the festival at all. So if we want to discover what Woodstock really sounded like, we have to go back. Back to the garden. For decades, this was the Woodstock we inherited. A legendary film, 2 classic soundtrack albums, and an incomplete picture of what actually happened on that stage. But slowly, the missing pieces of the puzzle began to return. More recordings emerged. Previously unseen performances were released. Complete Woodstock sets by individual artists finally saw the light of day. And with every new release, Woodstock became a little bigger, a little stranger, and most importantly, a lot more complete. 40 years after the festival, Rhino Records had already taken a major step towards telling the complete story with a 6 CD box set. But 10 years later, they went much further. In 2019, they released Woodstock, Back to the Garden, the definitive 50th anniversary archive, 38 discs, 36 hours of music, more than 400 tracks, almost every surviving note played on that stage, presented in the order in which the festival actually happened. And suddenly, Bert Sommer was back, Sweetwater was back, Grateful Dead, Creedence, Janis, the band Johnny Winter, Blood, Sweat, and Tears. They were all back. Not as bonus material attached to somebody else's version of Woodstock, but as part of the festival itself. And that's what makes this release so fascinating, because when you experience Woodstock this way, all the famous highlights are still there. Of course, Hendrix is still Hendrix, Santana still explodes on that stage, Joe Cocker still completely makes a Beatles song his own, but now you also hear what happened between those famous moments. The delays, the announcements, the rain, the atmosphere changing as afternoon turns into evening, evening into night, and night somehow becomes morning again. And perhaps most importantly, you hear the artist that history left behind. The original film gave us an extraordinary Woodstock. The soundtracks gave us even more, but neither gave us the complete Woodstock. And that's why this box set really couldn't have had a better title. Because 50 years later, after all the editing, all the selections, all the missing performances, and all the mythology, we could finally do what Joni Mitchell had been telling us to do all along. Back to the garden. So, which Woodstock is the real Woodstock? Is it the festival that nearly 500,000 people experienced in August 1969? Probably not even that one, because as we now know, even someone who was actually there on Yasgur's farm couldn't possibly have seen and heard everything. So, is it the Woodstock of the film, with those iconic images forever connected to Hendrix, Santana, Sly Stone, and Country Joe? Or is it the Woodstock of the soundtrack albums? The records that gave millions of people who had never been to Bethel the feeling that somehow they had been there too? Maybe the answer is all of them. Because Woodstock has long since become more than just what happened during those few days on a farm in New York State. It became a memory, a myth, an idealized image of a generation.
Goddamn hippie!
Whoa, dude!
Get out of here!
Not cool!
And like any memory, some moments grew larger and larger over the years, while others slowly faded away. That doesn't make the original film and soundtracks any less important. Quite the opposite. Without them, we'd probably remember Woodstock very differently today. But they don't tell the whole story. And maybe that's the most beautiful thing about finally being able to hear so much more. And somewhere above this entire story hangs the voice of a woman who was never actually at Woodstock. Joni Mitchell watched what happened from a distance and ultimately distilled it into a few words that perhaps explain better than any documentary ever could why Woodstock became so much bigger than just a music festival. We are stardust. We are golden. Maybe the real Woodstock was never one film, one soundtrack, or even one weekend. Maybe Woodstock is everything that happened there, and everything we turned it into afterwards. And that was Woodstock, the side of the festival that most people probably never knew. What were your highlights from these 3 days of peace and music? And which artists do you think absolutely should have made the original film or one of the soundtrack albums? Let me know in the comments and vote in the poll. Listen to all these hidden Woodstock gems in our Spotify playlist and check out the social media pages for all the latest updates, because I will follow you, if you follow me. And if you're not quite ready to leave the music of this era behind, then luckily, we don't have to go home just yet. We've already ranked every album by the Jimi Hendrix Experience. We also explored Sly and the Family Stone through Everyday People, a song whose message almost seems tailor-made for Woodstock. And if you want to spend a little more time immersed in the music and counterculture of the late 60s, make sure to check out our special on Laurel Canyon. But after this episode, there's one artist we simply can't ignore, Joni Mitchell, the woman who wasn't at Woodstock, but ultimately wrote the words we still use today to understand what Woodstock meant. We've explored her story before as well in Refugee of the Roads. Thank you for watching. See you next time. And in the meantime, drop the needle, press play, and remember, we're only in it for the music.